Hello and welcome to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, discuss the very challenging, interesting, rewarding world of self-publishing by talking to some of the figures we've met in this business who have some really insightful things to say about it. Today, we are very excited to have a special guest called Peter Gelfan, who has written a really, really interesting book on editing called Hurling Words into Darkness. And he's here to discuss editing and the importance of thinking like a writer. So good morning, Peter. How are you doing?
Good morning. Just fine.
It's very nice to have you. Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing good. So yeah, Peter, we were interested to talk to you because your book, it's different, I think, than a lot of other writing books out there. You have a different sort of look at how, as an editor, somebody who's been an editor for so long, and I know that you tutor writers as well. And I guess you have sort of a different way of, you think that writers should, sort of think about writing, right? And that's kind of what your book is about. Is that right?
Well, yes. It's not just to think about it. I'm sure most writers do think a lot about writing, but to think about it in a different way. And that we tend to think about writing that it's a craft or it's an art. And we tend to think of people reading a novel or going to a play or going to a movie, watching television, whatever it is. It's entertainment, or maybe it's cultural elevation or something like that. And I think it misses the point entirely of why we write and why we read. Why we read is what spawns why we write. If nobody was reading, nobody would be writing, obviously. So I think we have missed the real reason that humans are so addicted to storytelling and story listening. And I try to bring that out in this book and then apply it to how one might be able to improve their writing by taking this into account. It's not a whole bunch of new rules for this, that, and the other thing. It's just, look at it in this other way, as well as the way you're currently looking at it. And a lot of things fall into place, and your writing will be better and more effective.
That's interesting. So how is it that people think about storytelling, and what is it that we should be taking into account?
Okay. What we should be taking into account is why we read in the first place. And to think about the reason we read is because we want to be entertained, is to say that the reason we eat is because we love the taste of food. There's something more basic to that. And just about any creature has to learn from its own experiences. And there's some creatures who can learn from watching what happens to others of their kind. If the monkey sees the leopard grab his brother down there near the river, he's not going to go down near the river because he's learned from his brother's experience not to go down to the river. And that's about as far as it goes. But with humans, we can tell our brother, don't go down to the river because there's leopards down there. And we're about the only ones who can do that. To teach their children, don't go down to the river because there are leopards down there. So this is our special skill. Human beings, we know we're puny, we're vulnerable, we're slow, we're weak, we're pretty stupid about a lot of things. We don't have much hair to protect us. We don't have big claws and big teeth and all that kind of stuff. So why is it that we seem to be dominating this whole planet? And the reason is because we can learn from each other in a secondhand way. And so when you were reading a story, you are actually absorbing survival experience without having to have been there and risked it. Like we read war stories so that we can experience war without experiencing war. And And that's really what it's about. Why we read is to learn things that we can use. And going back to food, we eat food because we like it, yes, but we get energy and materials to heal and grow our bodies from eating. And we're learning survival skills from reading, but we read it because it's fun to read. This is great. This is exciting. And that's what I think. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, what a fascinating perspective, because you think storytelling is one of the oldest human traditions. We gathered around a campfire and told stories.
Exactly.
And you read the Torah and the Quran, and a lot of it is almost like not so much about religion, but it's almost like a guide to how to live. You know, don't eat the bottom feeders of the sea because the Nile used to have lots of bacteria in it, so it's a bad idea to eat the shrimp there. And so much of these stories have important lessons in and date back almost before the written word.
Yes. What scientists have also discovered, there's now actually a science of the mind. There wasn't with Freud and all that kind of stuff back then. There wasn't science. If somebody came up with a philosophical theory about we have little ids and egos in our head, you know, that do this, that, and the other thing. No, we have a brain in there, and so scientists have done a lot of brain research with with this fMRI imaging. You can see what the brain is doing while the person is thinking or speaking or whatever it is. And they've discovered that the way we think about life, the way we analyze life, the way we remember things is through stories. It's not data. We turn everything into a story. That we wanted this, or somebody wanted this, and they tried that, and it didn't work, and they got all screwed up, and then that happened, and that's how we remember things, and we remember how it happened. Things happen to us, and we can have a story. This happened to us in a story. If you actually go back and look at what actually happened, it was much more complicated than that. But it's a handy way to remember what happened is to store it as a story, and that's what we do. And so when we read a story and empathize with that story and empathize with the characters, we're learning their experience without having to, to go to outer space and have our tether removed from the.
Absolutely, that's so fascinating. I was just thinking of I got my start in advertising, and I used to write adverts and used to write mini stories because stories were what you could get people to be immersed in the story. You could almost sell them on the product. Like Budweiser does these amazing adverts every year where they've got the huge Clydesdale horses and the little puppies, and you end up with tears rolling down your cheeks, and you buy Budweiser even though it tastes like garbage, and it's because the storytelling is such an important part of it.
Right. Exactly. And if writers can look at their writing as you're giving someone an experience, and I think a lot of writers are more concerned with what they're getting out of it. It's like, oh, I'm expressing myself. I'm being artistic. I'm being, your readers don't care about you unless you're big and famous. Your readers don't care about you. They care about your characters. They don't know you. They don't care whether you're going to get rich off this book or not, or whether you have wonderful prose rhythms or something. They want a good story, well told. And I think a lot of writers miss this. And so writers tend to, unsuccessful writers, but they tend to try to be part of the show themselves without thinking what do readers want. And readers just want a wonderful story with wonderful characters that's going to wrap them up in another life, in another experience. And so all the stuff writers do to get the attention of their readers is actually distracting from what they are trying to do. They're making readers think about this guy's funny. Oh, this guy's a funny way of, and it's even things like putting it italics and caps and all, making your writing itself look kind of distracting. is distracting people from the story, and good writing just makes a very vivid story that people can just go into and inhabit that story and experience that story without bells and whistles to prove that, hey, I'm the writer. Look at me.
I find that kind of an interesting thing, because one of the situations we end up, Craig and I end up with a lot, and I experienced it myself as a writer, is you finish your book and then you're like, okay, how am I going to get people to read this? And you're right. It's almost like you should think, what am I going to write that people will want to read? Or how am I going to put it together in a way that people will want to read it? It's not the reader's obligation to learn to like an author's book, is it?
No, it isn't at all. They owe you nothing,
Right.
Especially if they paid for the book, they owe you nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of advertising and marketing is more about getting those people to discover your book in the first place, and then of course it's the writing that's going to take them forward, right? I'm thinking about the fact, I just started reading a lot of the Lee Child, Jack Reacher books, and that's one of these things where I know about the author. I watched the show on Amazon, and I've heard about him for many years, and I never actually read his books. And I finally decided, hey, I'm gonna just sit down and start reading them. And it's a similar sort of experience that I'm having with them. Is just on the second one now, but it really draws you in. He creates a lot of, like, the world. There's no fanciness to it. It's just, he's created a world that really, really draws you in. I don't know anything about a lot of the stuff he's talking about. A lot of it, like military stuff. I'm in Canada. We're not as sort of knowledgeable about a lot of the military and the guns and all this. And he's talking about it all, and it really paints a vivid picture that, and he does it in a good way, because I don't feel like he's explaining it and making it boring and telling me about the difference between a Glock and an M16 and a this and that, right? Like, he's just telling the story, and it's pulling me in, and I care about the character, and I want to read more, and there's nothing fancy, and it's a well done sort of thing, and it's teaching me. It's like I'm learning about things that I never had any knowledge about before. So yeah, I can totally see
that might one day be useful to you, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might go to war.
Well, actually, you say that. I remember in Lee Child books, there are like odd little things, like like when you're wandering through in the dark trying to sneak up on somebody, you keep one eye shut, and that's so if the light suddenly burst on, you're going to be completely blinded, and if they go off again, you'd have no night sight. But then you open up the eye that you had closed, and you can see in the dark. And it's like, that's a stupid thing you read in a book that you actually remember. And when I'm wandering around the house going to the bathroom in the middle of the night, I always keep one eye closed in case any of my kids switch on the light suddenly. It's like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's true. I've learned tons of little things like that in these books. I mean, again, things that I might never use. A lot of them, I think the one I'm reading now, he was talking about how the sentries were doing it wrong. They were just standing around, and then somebody comes and kills one, and the other ones don't know about it, but they're supposed to go in their circle pattern so that when they're walking, and if one does get killed, the other ones will find their body right away, because they're doing their back and forth sentry, And so I was like, I never really thought about, the best way to be a sentry. Like, I had no idea there was a good way or a bad way. It's true. It's teaching us, and I agree. Like, it's something I've said to my son a lot, is that he reads a lot, and I'm like, I've said to him in the past, like, that's what has made people dominate this planet, is our ability to pass on information. I don't have to relearn every single thing that everyone else has learned just to be able to do what I need to do. I don't have to know how to build a car first before I can drive, because I can buy a car because someone else did it, and I don't have to learn how to drive on my own because someone can teach me how to drive. I can read the book on how to drive. I can pass that information, whether it's verbally or, which animals can't do either, passing it on verbally or through reading a manual. I don't have to know how to do anything that I don't want to know how to do, that I want to have to learn how to do myself, because someone else has already done it. And then I can take that as a building block and go from there. And everyone doesn't have to start from zero all the time. And that's why we're able to have cities and internet
Absolutely.
and TVs and all the things that my son likes. So I'm trying to put that in perspective for him, you know?
Yes. And if it's a well-told story, you'll get emotionally involved. So these things will stick better.
I think that's where the storytelling really comes in. That's the difference. So an instruction manual doesn't make you feel any emotion apart from maybe frustration, whereas a story can make you feel an emotion, and you can get completely swept up in it. And I mean, the number of books I've finished where I had tears running down my eyes and stuff like that, that doesn't happen when you are doing a community college course, unless they're
Right.
tears of frustration. Whereas if you read a book, it can get into your heart, and at that point, whatever made you feel that way sticks in your brain.
Right. And that's the whole point of it, of what I'm trying to say, is that if you tell a good story, people will pay attention to it. They'll get entirely involved in it. Their whole brain will be working at this thing. And that way they can learn something. Whereas if you just tell them, and this is another thing, a lot of writers, one of the biggest mistakes you can do in writing a novel is to tell the reader what it means. Or start it off by saying, well, this is about how, if you're not honest, you're going to get into big trouble. And you've just short-circuited what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's also
go ahead, Gary.
That's also the trickiest part sometimes too, right? It's like, how much do I need to tell the reader? And readers come with all sorts of different levels of comprehension and this and that, right? How much do I need to tell the reader so that my point gets across without me beating them over the head with my point, right?
Right, and the spy novels can teach you the correct way to approach this with their need to know thing. It's all need to know with your exposition. Don't tell them anything unless you absolutely have to, and don't tell them anything except the smallest amount that you need to tell them, and don't tell them until you must tell them. Don't tell them in advance. It's kind of need to know for the novelist.
Now, you mentioned earlier that writing, some people I think of it as a craft. I definitely don't think of it as an art. But when it comes to like storytelling, how much sort of structure do you value? Because I know I've written 30 books and I didn't get into story structure until like book 15, and I managed to blag my way through half of it, because I think as human beings we intrinsically know vaguely what a story should be. It's
Yes.
But then when you start to actually study it, you read like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey and Dan Harmon's The Story Circle, you see that there's almost a science to what makes an effective story. How much value do you put into that?
I put some value into it. I do think that you need enough structure that you're going to create, that you're going to end up creating a story, and usually that has to do with there's an important problem that you have to solve, and you don't know how to do it, and you try this and that, and then the first one can't work, because then your novel turns into a very short story. So I think that is true. As to all these various systems, I don't think you necessarily need that. Is the hero's journey going to fit this story? And it may not, or you may try to. You think, well, we can do it this way or that way, but I don't think you need to think about it that way. I think you do need to think about a good story having an important problem that needs to be solved, that your main character has to solve, and that your readers are going to get involved in.
So I think in your book you call that predicament and attempted extrication.
Yes, that's actually Gottschalk's definition. I thought was very handy.
Well, can you talk a bit more about that? Sort of break that down a little bit.
Well, sure. You have to have a character in your story, and then that character is going to get into some kind of a predicament, an important problem or situation that they need to deal with. And the rest of the book is the attempted extrication. Sometimes they don't do it. Sometimes they fail. It's a tragedy. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes it gets turned around on its head and turns into something else. But you need a character, and you need something that they have to worry about or do something about. And then that's what the story is, how they solve this problem. Now, not all novels are like that. There are novels that don't have that particular structure, that are more and they're usually considered the avant-garde ones, the weird writers, and they have something else. Each of those stories has something else that is keeping the readers with them. Maybe it's beautiful writing, poetic writing, or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily have that plot. And if you want to write a book without a plot, but there's wonderful writing and beautiful ideas or something like that, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. But just keep in mind that you are choosing not to use perhaps the most powerful tool in storytelling, which is the character predicament, attempted extrication, as Gottschalk puts it. So you have to make up for it with something else, and there are examples of that. There are stories that are hysterically funny, that have no plot. The characters are unbelievable. It's ridiculous, but you're laughing your ass off, and that's very valuable to people.
See, Seinfeld's a great example of that, isn't it?
Well, they always have a predicament, but it's also funny. There's usually 2 or 3 predicaments. Each character has some horrible angst going on in the story.
Yeah,
and they almost never solve it. And
it's
that's
hard. I think it's hard to write something without any sort of predicament, any sort of conflict, any sort of, I can't even personally think about any examples where there is none. I mean, it almost sounds like you're writing a book on philosophy at that point, not really a novel, right?
Well, it could have a sequence of events that doesn't have a particular problem, or it could just be these slice of life novels where they just narrate the day in the life of someone, but there isn't a problem there. It's just, or it's there are avant-garde, so-called avant-garde novels like that, and people like them because it makes them very intellectual, because there are interesting ideas, that the writing is good. There might be some humor in it. There might be some characters that you've never met before, people that you've never seen their life before, and that's all worthwhile. But you don't have this. What you don't get is the learning experience that going through a character's ordeal will give you. So I think people should write whatever they want to write, but keep in mind that this is what is the usual payoff of a story. And if you're going to ignore that, be aware that you are ignoring it, and make up for it.
Because I guess you could say, like, a book that is non-traditional, like Jack Kerouac or On the Road or something, that isn't. It might be a book that's important to literature, but it's not going to sell as many copies as Harry Potter or something like that, because the story and the characters and the predicament tend to make books more, I would say, more compelling to people to read in the first place.
Yes, but I also should probably clarify that I don't mean that every novel needs to be a thriller at all. And Kerouac's On the Road, there are implied problems in it. They're looking for the meaning of life or something like that, and things happen, and so I'm not saying it has to be very plot forward, that it has to be a thriller type thing, or mystery or something like that. But there has to be a conflict that the characters are trying to work through.
That conflict could be an internal conflict, right? It could be character change. It could be, they're going through something.
Absolutely. And often with the better novels, you've got both going. You've got an external conflict that needs to be solved, but to solve it, you have to solve an internal conflict. There's right. the character conflict going on as well as the external conflict. And then there's the conflict between characters. You could have two guys trying to accomplish something that's the same thing, but they hate each other, and that kind of thing.
Right. And then by the end, they've changed and been able to see each other's perspective. And now they're different, better people, and they've changed themselves as well as changed their external circumstances too. Yeah.
Right.
And of course, for us as the reader, that's the lesson. The lesson is sometimes you have to see things from other people's perspectives and find compromise or find a middle ground or something. So I guess, yeah, it always teaches you something.
It always teaches you, even if you can't put it into exact words. I think it teaches you something. In many novels, it's hard to boil it down to a one-sentence description of what happens in the novel. But there is conflict, and there is problem, and there are good and bad outcomes, and that it settles in somehow without necessarily having what's sometimes called the elevator pitch, which is, if you have to explain to somebody in an elevator, like this producer in the elevator that's going up 5 floors with you, you've got to give them the gist of your story in a very quick pitch. Not all novels. You can't do that with all novels.
No, I mean, that's like the blurb. I spend a lot of time writing blurbs for other authors, and it can be really challenging when you're like, okay, what is the crux of the story? I think authors themselves, it's very difficult for them to write blurbs for their own books because often they're too close to the material.
The blurb is harder than the novel.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
A great piece of advice that I've never followed is write the blurb first and then write the novel, but I've never done that.
Yeah. Then you're sort of like handcuffing yourself to sticking to that, right?
Right.
But I'm thinking, I don't remember the details. I have notoriously bad memory, but one feeling that stuck with me when I read Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which, is he ended up passing away before he even finished the series. It was something like 13 books, and Sanderson took it over at the end. And I remember when I started reading it 20 years ago or whatever it was, I really got the feeling in the first 3 books that it was supposed to be a 3-book series. And then I had that feeling halfway through the 3rd book that he realized he could just keep writing these books, and sort of everything changed. Like it felt like, again, this is like really the way I feel more about, maybe it's not totally true if I reread them now, but the feeling I came away from it was, there was this big conflict and this big thing building. And then in the halfway through the 3rd book, it was like, but that's not the real conflict. The real conflict is still to come. And then I was like, really? But anyways, I kept reading because I'm a completionist. And so, but I remember there was one book deep into the series, like, I don't know, book 8 or 9, who knows, where I read that book, and it was not a short book. They were all very long books. And I came away from that book thinking, nothing happened in this book at all. Like everything, you could just drop this book. Like nobody moved forward, the plot didn't change. And that to me is almost where there was no journey, there was no conflict. There was maybe little conflict throughout, but at the end of the day, nothing really changed. And so it's almost easier to do that in a series where you have this overarching plot and conflict, but you can write a book where it's really just exposition and people just wandering and continuing on their paths. I wouldn't recommend it, but I can almost see how that would be easier to sell than a standalone book where nothing happens, because there's no reason, people aren't invested in it, right? I was invested at that point. So
probably true,
yeah.
So Peter, what are some of the books that have really made an impact in your life in this way?
Well, I think the first book that really had that kind of an impact on me was Catch-22. I was a young teen when it came out, and the only long books that could be considered for adults that I'd read were those that were assigned in school. And normally, I didn't find them very interesting. Silas Marner and stuff. It never connected with me. And then with Catch-22, I was reading it, and it was a tragedy and it was a comedy. It was a hysterically funny tragedy, and it just made me see that writing could be creative. It's not just something that your English teacher makes you read. And that book had an impression.
I mean, that book has such a strong lesson in it as well. It's
got many.
The term catch-22 now, you know, refers to the it's so odd. So many people I know say the term we're in a catch-22 situation, and then when you talk to them about it, some of them don't even realize it was a book, and it was the book that came up with this, you know, impossible to win scenario.
Right.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. The thing was named after the book. It wasn't that the book was named after the thing that was already there. So
it was about a pilot who wanted to get out of war service because he said you have to be completely crazy to be able to do this. He tried to claim insanity to get out of flying these dangerous missions, and the army was like, well, if you know that you want to claim insanity to get out of flying these missions, that proves you're sane. Right. And it's kind of like this loop that gets stuck in there, which I think any of us who gets involved in bureaucracy, you know, going down to the DMV to register your car, you see all these catch-22 situations, and there is definitely a lesson there, and it's become part of the cultural idiom.
Right. And other books. My sister, to the horror of my parents, gave me one of Henry Miller's books for a birthday present once.
Oh,
and
cancer.
Of course, it was very lurid and full of sex, but it was also, you know, this is a guy who could write passionately about just things that were happening to him, and it struck me that you just, and it's almost plotless. A lot of his books. It's just, this is what happened. This is what happened. And it's all very interesting, and he can tell it with such passion and insight that it's that's again struck me with the power of reading. Even if you took the sex out, it would be very, very interesting and readable.
But would it be as popular? So do you have sort of any advice or techniques that you give authors to make sure that they're, you know, doing all right?
There's a lot of them in the book, and to try to be how this book came about, and I'll try to be brief here, is that editing for years and years and years, and when I first started, you know, I'd have to sort of explain what a plot was to somebody, and then I would write it off and send it off to them. And then maybe 2 months later, I'd get another book to edit, and well, this guy doesn't understand plot, so I'd have to type up about a plot. And there was many of these things like that I realized I was repeating. So I thought, I got lazy, and I thought, instead of repeating them, when I think I've really explained something well, I'm going to copy it and put it in this boilerplate file I have over here. And so I did that for years and years and years and years. I thought, oh, well, this is a good way to explain character. This is a good way to explain why dialogue should be this or that. And I ended up with almost 100 pages of this thing. And a few years ago, I thought, I'm getting on, and I'm not going to be editing forever. I'm going to get senile, and I'm going to die. And there's a lot of stuff that I've written here that I think is very useful, and very useful to a lot of authors, that I've never seen in other books about writing. And I'd read other books about writing just to make sure I wasn't missing something, and pick up a few tips. And so I thought I should just take these and, you know, somehow preserve what I have learned that isn't somewhere else. And so then I tried to organize these things, and as I organized them, I realized that there's something. It's not just the organizing principle. There is something was coming slowly into shape about putting these together, and then I, you know, put this section here, and it finally occurred to me what was going on, which was in one of the things being that when you're writing, you have to be careful not to distract readers. A lot of the things that it's considered bad writing, you're distracting readers and from the story. And as I said earlier, some writers like to distract readers from the stories, so the readers think about them. And that works against you. So then I put that together with a lot I'd been reading about brain science, and then it all fell into place. This is what is happening. This is why we read stories, and this is how writers are preventing their readers from experiencing the story they're telling. And so most of the things that I go over in detail have to do with things that distract readers while you're writing. Just keep them in the story, keep your own nose out of the story. But there's a lot of things that writers do habitually that are distracted and are considered part of writing.
Now, obviously, you don't want to give away all of the details in the book. Could you give us some examples of things that the writers do that are distracting?
Okay, sure. Let's take dialogue. Let's say you're doing a passage of dialogue. Two characters are having an argument, say. And what I'm saying that you want is you just want the reader sitting there in that room watching that argument. It's just the two characters arguing and the reader, the fly on the wall. And but then you can just have the lines of dialogue and in very minimalistic ways make sure the readers know who is speaking the line of dialogue. Or you can say, George said heartily and smiled, and Susan said because she really wanted him to understand what she was saying. It's the writer butting in to interpret the story for the readers. And if your story needs interpreting, then write the story better.
I think that's brilliant. It's funny. I wrote a blog post for Hidden Gems recently about Jane Austen and Ernest Hemingway and their use of dialogue and why their books are so timeless. Because it's the attribution. I think that's the cardinal sin of so many new writers. Is they have to say, I'd like a cup of tea, he said with a smile. Yeah. Certainly, she poured the cup of tea and smiled at him with a wink or something. Here is your cup of tea. Oh, this cup of tea is delicious, he said pleasantly. And those things that he said pleasantly, she did this. It's like if you cut them all out. Ernest Hemingway had this wonderful way of just one line of dialogue, one line of dialogue, one line of dialogue. And then if he had to, he put in a he said as an attribution, just so your brain like caught up with the back and forth. But apart from that, you didn't have anything except pure dialogue. And even right. Jane Austen 200 years ago did that. And that's, I think, why her books remain so timeless, is because they were written in that way that, as you said, didn't distract people. I think it's fantastic advice.
I cover in the book a little bit the history of writing novels, and going right back to, Cervantes and things like that. And the history of writing novels is to have the author be less and less present. Back then, they would say things, dear reader, I'm about to tell you about something that really breaks my heart, but I think you need to know about it, so forgive me if I cause you any pain. And then goes through the incident.
That's pretty much the opening of every Shakespeare play, isn't it?
But then you see, when you watch the play, when you read it, yes, but when you watch it, it's just the actors on the stage. And no one is sitting there saying why he said that, and the actor figures out, am I smiling? Am I frowning? Am I angry? The actor figures that out, but doesn't tell the audience. They just act it. So it's part of the scene. You're in the scene and you see it. And that's what, there's a big difference between saying that, that someone someone says something angrily, as opposed to saying he gave her a dirty look,
or he tightened his
fist. And then he says the line of dialogue. Now it's in the scene. Now it's in the scene. His manner. What was his action? As opposed to the author explaining, oh, now he's really angry, so he stomps his foot at no. So yes, and you come up further and further into the present time, and there's the author's no longer on the stage.
And I think that makes for a lot more of an enjoyable reading experience and a memorable reading experience.
That was exactly my point. You've got a better experience there. You're not listening to some guy relating something. You are there in it, watching it.
Right. It's like the show don't tell, right? You know, if you're writing it well, the readers will be able to figure out if he's angry. You
Right.
don't need to say he said it angrily.
Right.
They'll know. Yeah.
And you don't have to make it too easy for them, because if you make it too easy for them, you're not making them think.
Yeah.
That's another thing that I think the mistake that authors, they explain so much to the reader that the reader doesn't have to put two and two together. And if the reader isn't putting two and two together, they're losing most of the fun and benefit of reading the book.
So Lee Child, we spoke about earlier, I think he has a very economical use of language. And I think one of the most satisfying things, he has very short chapters. They're almost like potato chips. You can't stop at just one. But each chapter, you learn something new, and it makes you feel smart, and it makes you think, and it makes you start putting the things together. And that's an incredibly satisfying reading experience.
Yes. And it also literally exercises your brain. So if you learn to read people in novels, you will get better at reading people in real life. And boy, do we need to read people in real life. I mean, that is probably the important skill that a human being has, is to figure out what these other guys are up to.
Yeah.
Because,
absolutely.
I mean, everything else is taken care of, you know? Just the air
And especially America is so divisive right now, almost because of that. You know, there's half of the country hates the other half of the country, and there's no empathy between them. And then stories like this, stories could possibly be a way to bridge that gap if you can see an opinion from somebody else's perspective.
Yep.
I'm optimistic, and I like to think humans aren't all bad people. So, you know, you could have two completely diametrically opposed people, but there's probably something you like about them. I mean, even Hitler was nice to dogs.
As long as they weren't Jewish dogs.
Yes, I suppose so.
Yeah.
Well, we are almost coming up to the end of our time together. But Peter, where can people find this book?
There's an earlier edition of this book out that you can get paperback only on Amazon. This book is the second edition, which is probably maybe is 10% different from the other one, or has more stuff than the other one. And that's going to be, it's going to have a better cover, and it's going to also have a digital version, and that will be coming out end of September.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure to drop a link down to where that is on Amazon. Or you have a website?
I have a website, but it's also I think I'll let Jane figure out this kind of, you know, Jane Ryder, figure out what's the best strategy for where to direct people.
And we'll make sure it's down below in the description of this video. But
Great.
Peter, before we go, like, do you have any parting advice? If there are aspiring writers who are listening to this, what's the one thing that we haven't covered that you would tell them to stick in the old noggin and let it rattle around?
That you're giving readers an experience, that you want them to experience it on their own, and don't copycat.
That's interesting.
Don't try to write like, don't try to do the next Harry Potter.
Do your own thing.
Do your own thing in a way that's going to be useful to readers.
So, and Craig, do you have any additional questions?
No, I think it's, you know, it's a fascinating discussion. I think we really, you know, like you said, I remember the article you wrote about the sort of dialogue. You have to write it economically, right? You want to make sure that people can follow it, but you don't want to add in too much to be both distracting or to, you know, be always telling them what they should be thinking and how they should be understanding. And I think that applies, like you said, to so many other parts of writing, and not just dialogue. So it's definitely something that I think a lot of writers could benefit from doing a better job at. So I think reading your book might be the best way that they can do that. So we'll definitely, this episode will probably come out around when your book drops. And so we will definitely have a link to it down below.
Great. Perfect.
That is wonderful. Well, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I kind of like it because it's different to a lot of the other discussions we've spoken about, but they all have their interconnecting things. We just spoke to Melinda, who wrote a book about character, and then you spoke about how important character is. And it's great to learn all of these different things from different people and put them together and get new perspectives. And it's, you know, we've sat here, you told us the story of how you wrote your book, and there you are telling us a story that puts it in our brain a little better. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to wrap. Well, we are going to wrap this up now. They'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. But until then, make sure, if you like what Peter had to say, drop a comment down below. If you haven't already, subscribe, whether you're listening to this, where you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Make sure you give us a like. And thank you very much for continuing to support this podcast.